We're going to look obviously at what the scriptures say. But I thought it would be helpful for us this morning to look at what the psychiatrists say first. After all, our politicians felt that this was so damaging and so destructive that conversion therapy was just running unchecked and rampant through all the clinical counseling offices all across Canada that they had to do something about it. And when we ask, what kind of conversion therapies did you have in mind when you passed this legislation? The number one answer that was given was, well, we just want to make sure that we didn't have counselors out there doing electroshock therapy or behavioral modification to the extent what's been described to me is you have someone who identifies as homosexual and you bring them into your office and you show them homosexual pornography, and if they start to experience arousal, you shock them or something like that, so that they begin to associate the pain of electroshock with, homosexual pornography, and they begin to disassociate, these kinds of things, right? And so if this is what we're doing, we're passing this law to ban these sorts of practices, then of course we should have like some sort of, I apologize for my use of words, but there should be some sort of pandemic of guys running around out there with, car batteries and jumper cables just waiting to shock people who look homosexual, right? That's what you'd expect given the fact that they felt the need to pass a law, right? Well, as a matter of fact, that's not what we find at all. Again, the question is, does it cause harm? And what exactly is it that these people are doing that we need to outlaw, that we're worried is causing harm? And is change possible? Perhaps the most famous study that was ever done was done by an individual by the name of Robert Spitzer. Okay, Robert Spitzer. And as we look at Robert Spitzer's research, we need to know a little bit about Robert Spitzer. He's not a Christian. I was not able in my studying of Dr. Robert Spitzer to find anything about him in terms of his beliefs in Jesus or religion. He is most prominently known as a gay rights activist. In fact, Dr. Robert Spitzer is legendary. You may be familiar with the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM. It is sort of the Bible that psychiatrists and psychologists use in order to understand mental health disorders, and we're on our fifth edition of it. But when we changed the third edition to say that homosexuality was to no longer be regarded as a mental health condition, the individual that pioneered and championed that change was none other than Dr. Spitzer. And his belief was that homosexuality was not a mental health issue, that it was a normal part of life, and as a result, psychiatrists and psychologists should not be categorizing homosexuality as a disease in any way, shape, or form. Now, the effort to ban all psychological, medical, clinical attempts at conversion therapy, or reparative therapy, as it's also been called, started way back in the 80s. And right around the year 2000, Dr. Spitzer, who was the gay rights activist, who describes himself proudly as a gay rights activist, who championed the change of the DSM to no longer categorize homosexuality as a disease, conducted a study to address what the American Psychiatric Association was calling indisputable harm that resulted as a matter of course from conversion therapy. He says in his study, and I'm reading to you directly from the introduction, in recent years, quote, "In recent years there has been a marked change about both the desirability and the feasibility of attempts to alter a homosexual sexual orientation. In the past, such change was generally considered both desirable and possible." He lists dozens of studies going back to the 60s, which revealed that indeed a person's sexual orientation could be altered, and indeed in which individuals wanted it altered because they struggled with dissatisfaction with their homosexual orientation. They wanted to live, in their words, a more normal lifestyle. And so multiple clinicians, multiple psychiatrists going back to the 60s had conducted studies and found that such a change in orientation was possible. So he lists those studies. And then he goes on to say, quote, "An increasing number of clinicians believe that such change rarely, if ever, occurs, and that psychotherapy with this goal often is harmful by increasing self-loathing, lowered self-esteem, hopelessness, and depression." And he quotes a couple of articles from different psychologists who list these harms as having taken place as a result of conversion therapy. Now, he goes on to make this statement. The 2000 American Psychiatric Association position statement on therapies focused on attempts to change sexual orientation noted that, quote, there have been no scientifically rigorous outcome studies to determine either the actual efficacy or the harm of so-called reparative treatments. That's what it was known at that time. This is early 2000s, 2003 to be exact. No clinical studies have been done to show that individuals who've undergone conversion therapy or reparative therapy, as it's also known, no clinical studies have been done that show that harm was done. This is all anecdotal. This is all just people thinking that this is what's happening, but we haven't actually assessed it. We haven't actually measured it. So he goes on. The purpose of this study, therefore, is to assess the feasibility of conversion as well as the harm that is experienced as a result of such therapies. That's the goal of this study. He's answering the two questions that I want to know. Okay? And in case you're wondering, he gets into all the nitty-gritties that we might say is just too much information. He wants to know not only about an individual's self-identification, how a person thinks of themselves. He wants to know about whether or not they experience yearning or arousal, whether or not they're actually capable of having sexual intercourse in a heterosexual manner, and he gets into all of those nitty-gritties. He surveys over 200 different individuals, both men and women. Quote, critics, here's another excerpt from his study, quote, critics of reparative therapy acknowledge that therapy can change homosexual behavior by the individual resisting acting on homosexual feelings. However, critics say, homosexual orientation itself remains unchanged. For the purposes of this study, a person's sexual orientation is operationalized by multiple measures of sexual attraction, including arousal, fantasy, yearning, as well as overt behavior, by which he means actual intercourse. Okay? That's a direct quote. He's measuring all of those things. So what were the results of this study? He identified 200 individuals that were previously identified as homosexual, who had lived a homosexual lifestyle for a number of years, over a decade were the parameters of his study. And now they must identify as heterosexual, and they must have been identifying and living as a heterosexual individual for a minimum of 5 years. The results of the study found this to be the case. Pre-assessment, pre-reparative therapy, pre-conversion therapy, men who underwent conversion therapy identified 100% in this study, 100% of the men in this study identified as homosexual, 100%. Post-therapy, post-conversion therapy, 53% of the men in this study now identified as heterosexual, and he means they have sexual intercourse in a heterosexual manner. They are no longer feeling attracted to individuals of the same gender. They are now feeling attracted and experiencing sexual activities with people of a different gender than theirs. Of the women, 84%. Again, pre-conversion therapy, 100% identified as homosexual. Post-conversion therapy, 84% changed their sexual orientation. Now, those are some big numbers. Is it possible? The law of Canada and the government of Canada say that it's a myth, that such things don't happen. But the most comprehensive study ever done, published in 2003, less than 20 years old, says that for 54% of men and 84% of women, it does happen. What about harm? This question of harm. Are we hurting people? Quote, depression has been reported to be a common side effect of unsuccessful attempts to change sexual orientation. Listen closely. Quote, this was not the case for our participants, who often reported that they were markedly or extremely depressed prior to conversion therapy, but rarely that depressed post-conversion therapy. To the contrary, at post-assessment, the vast majority reported that they were, quote, not at all or only, quote, slightly depressed. Males less depressed than females, males at 91%, females at 88% less depressed post-therapy. Participants were presented with a list of several ways that the therapy might have been considered very helpful apart from the change in sexual orientation. Just put a pause on that. Remember, 54% of men were able to change their sexual orientation. That's not 100%. We're still talking about 46% of men who went through conversion therapy and it was unsuccessful. So the question was, now that you have tried and been unsuccessful, do you feel depressed? The response was, no, I don't feel depressed. No, I'm not filled with more hopelessness and more self-loathing. Just the opposite. They're less depressed, they're more hopeful, and a list of alternative successful outcomes was presented for them to consider, and the majority of respondents said, quote, it was notable, this is what Dr. Spitzer writes in his research study, it was notable that the majority of respondents post-conversion therapy were feeling more masculine for males or more feminine for females, and they considered this a very positive outcome. In other words, they still struggle with homosexual attraction. 46% of men and 12% of women were incapable of making the orientation change. However, they still valued the effort because even in the effort, they felt more like themselves afterwards, what they wanted to be, which was either more masculine or more feminine. They were not depressed. There was no psychological harm. And now you might be wondering, what exactly did Spitzer do? Did he, electroshock them? Was that what was going on here? No. Spitzer says real change in sexual orientation seems plausible as the participants used change strategies commonly effective in all psychotherapies utilized today. For example, he's going to tell you, participants often developed a narrative linking childhood or family experiences to current problems. They received support from a group or other individual who mentored them. They utilized thought-stopping strategies, and they avoided situations that triggered homosexual feelings. In other words, what they're being counseled to do is, hey, if you start to think about homosexual things, stop thinking about those things. And don't put yourselves in situations where you might be tempted to act out on those kinds of things. And also, let's talk about why you feel these desires in the first place. But what's most damning, in my opinion, about this conclusion, Spitzer, and I'll draw your attention to this, Spitzer says, quote, they used change strategies that were commonly effective in all psychotherapies being used today. In other words, for issues not related to homosexuality, these so-called therapies that they're employing are therapies that are used across the spectrum to address a broad range of issues. This is not car battery and jumper cables. They're outlawing practices for sexual orientation change, which practices are still widely used in all manner of other kinds of counseling and therapy. If the practices are harmful, let's outlaw the practices. If the practices can be shown to be effective, at least in terms of men, 54%, in terms of women, 88%, then it is possible for orientation to happen. And as these same people say, even amongst the ones that did not experience a successful change in orientation, they did not report harm. They weren't hurt by it. And if the therapies are harmful, let's ban them across the board. But of course, the issue isn't the therapies. This is the real problem. The issue is how we are to regard homosexual behavior, transgenderism in the first place. Now you might be thinking, well, that's just one study, Pastor Josh. It is not one study. There are multiple studies. Carton and Wade, clinical psychologists and researchers working in the Department of Psychology for Fordham University, published a study called Sexual Orientation Change Efforts, SOCE. They looked specifically at sexual orientation change efforts in men, and they looked at it from a client perspective. Their specific question was they wanted to understand how harmful it was to undergo reparative therapy. The study looked at 116 men, specifically men again, who had undergone reparative therapy and reorientation therapy, and they asked very specific questions about what were the best clinical techniques, what the clients found to be most helpful in their change efforts. And what they found was, in terms of, they found two things, what we call clinical techniques, as well as interventions. These is psychological jargon. A clinical technique is what the counselor is using in the counselor's office. And then an intervention is to be understood as the strategy that the individual uses when they go home, the week in between visits to the counselor's office. In terms of best psychiatric clinical techniques, it was determined by the clients who underwent reparative or conversion therapy that exploring and analyzing for the purposes of better understanding the causes of one's homosexual and one's own emotional needs were very effective. In other words, these individuals wanted to know why they felt the way that they felt, and they wanted to talk about it. Number two, developing non-sexual relationships with same-sex peers, that is, people of the same gender, developing relationships with mentors, family members, and friends was considered the most helpful clinical intervention. In other words, individuals who underwent reparative therapy or conversion therapy, as it's known, found that the most helpful thing was to be able to have a friend in which they could talk about what they were going through. They wanted to change, and they wanted a friend who would talk to them about the change that they were attempting to achieve, which is why Bill C-4 is particularly heinous, because it makes those conversations illegal. Again, not the only study. I see time is starting to get away from us, but I wanted to just ask another question in my research. And there were dozens upon dozens of studies. I spent over $400 purchasing all these scientific journals. You're welcome to read them. I've got copies of it in my office. But the other question I wanted to ask was, how long does change take? If it's possible and it's not harmful, how long do we strive until we see results? Jones and Yarhouse, 2011 study, titled A Longitudinal Study of Attempted Mediated Sexual Orientation Change. That's a mouthful. Say, those are some big words, Pastor. What in the world? Basically, they started with, again, 116 individuals, and they walked with them over the course of 7 years and assessed at what point during the course of therapy, 7-year-long study, did these individuals begin to experience significant change in their sexual orientation. The results, again, it varies, but on average, again, over 7 years, a change from homosexual to heterosexual desire in a mediated program, 23% experienced the change, and it took, on average, 3 to 4 years. So they gathered a group of guys together, they began therapy, and somewhere between year 3 and year 4, the respondents began to acknowledge that they were changing, What's interesting about the Jones and the Yarhouse study, again, they got a bunch of people together. 23% of the individuals in this particular study reported change, which means 70%, over 70%, did not experience change. Those that did experience change in this particular study, it took 3 to 4 years before they experienced change. But that leaves the overwhelming majority in this particular study who did not experience change at the 7-year mark. However, if we're talking about change in terms of heterosexual attraction, going from feeling homosexual to feeling heterosexual, 23% experienced change at the 3 to 4 year mark, but an additional 30% experienced change at the 3 to 4 year mark, not away from homosexual to heterosexual, but away from overwhelming homosexual desires to what respondents considered to be stable, celibate sexual behavior. In other words, they had determined that they did not want to be homosexual anymore, regardless of whether or not they became heterosexual. And again, when you group that number of respondents in at the 3 to 4 year mark, the 30% experienced what I would call chastity, and 23% experienced a reorientation entirely, which means you're talking 53% that ceased from homosexual activity and were able to do it. Coming back to, and harm, that study again asked the question about harm. Quote, evidence from this study suggests that the change of homosexual orientation appears possible for many, and that psychological distress did not increase on average. This is across 7 years. Psychological distress did not increase on average for any participants as a result of the involvement in this conversion therapy, end quote. They don't even experience increased stress. It's the ordinary stress. Dr. Robert Spitzer, coming back to him. Last paragraph of his essay, his research. Quote, these findings of considerable benefits and no obvious harm in this study suggest that the current recommendations by the American Psychiatric Association that ethical practitioners refrain from attempts to change individuals' sexual orientation is based on a double standard. It implies that it is unethical for a clinician to provide reparative therapy because there is inadequate scientific evidence of effectiveness, whereas it assumes that it is ethical to provide gay affirmative therapy for which there is also no rigorous scientific evidence of effectiveness, and for which, like reparative therapy, there have been reports and testimonials of harm. Dr. Spitzer does not identify publicly as a Christian. He is a gay rights activist. He was instrumental in the redefining of homosexuality, no longer as a disease, but to be considered as an acceptable lifestyle. And his study asked the question, does harm occur? Yes or no? Is change possible? Yes or no? In both cases, he says harm does not occur, change is possible, and his conclusion is all of these so-called stories about harm are pure anecdote, and it's all based on a double standard. They're criticizing reparative therapy, saying that change, these so-called stories of change are purely anecdotal. He's saying my research now proves it is not anecdotal. There are real people, and he has a database which is still able to be accessed again for a small fee, but he still has a database of these individuals to this day. It is not anecdotal. It works for some individuals. The claim that harm is occurring is anecdotal, and there are, based on my research to date, no studies that actually verify harm has happened.